After a wave of strikes taking place in Tbilisi, a controversial new law targeting media was introduced, showing Russia's clear influence on Georgian politics.
And to talk about the situation in Georgia, we are now joined by Viktor Kipiani, chair of the Georgian think tank organization GeoCase. Mr. Kipiani's field of expertise includes international relations, security, governance, implications of the global order for Georgia and for its neighborhood and macro economy. Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, Mr. Kipiani, a very simple question, but I guess it could be a tricky one as well. What direction do you think Georgia is going, and how could this affect the region?
Well, of course, with that same law you just mentioned in your introduction, I won't be saying that we are yet there to say that there is an authoritarian regime in Georgia, but there are certainly some unsettling dynamics, and those unsettling dynamics, they relate not to the law itself, but primarily to the various statements and malign rhetorics by different stakeholders, especially taking into account that we're on the way of opening. Hopefully, we still keep fingers crossed that accession talks would be opened by European Union, although that law clearly has undermined the pro-European path of Georgia, and we already have some statements by EU member nations that the chances for opening the accession talks are practically down to zero. So all in all, of course, the dynamics are very much troublesome, unsettling, and worrisome.
Georgia is about to re-establish its diplomatic ties with Russia by opening an embassy in Moscow, and I'd like to ask you about legal consequences of this move. Does it mean that Georgia is willing to seize the Russian-occupied territories?
Listen, I'm not sure where from this influence. This is not just the gossip. To be frank with you, it's very malign disinformation and hybrid. It's a part of the hybrid war, which is probably directed by some people on either side of an aim to destabilize the situation in Georgia. You mentioned correctly that in the conditions of ongoing occupation and creeping annexation, thinking or making statements or making any gestures or moves by Georgian authorities to restore diplomatic relations with Russia, that would be, well, politically suicidal, and that would be equal to the national treason. By the way, we already had a statement earlier today by the Russian MFA, which has strongly denied any talks or any discussions on restoring the diplomatic relations. So I think that there is not much basis to discuss in more substance or more details that those news.
All right.
I would like to take a look at the new media law. Do you think this might be a way of Russia to actually make sure that Georgia is not being considered, or it's perhaps pushed further away from from becoming an EU potential new member state?
Well, frankly, what concerns me, it's not about what the Russians are saying, but what EU is saying about the process in Georgia and about the political process, including that specific piece of legislation. And us following getting the candidacy status, definitely that specific law, and not just that law, I'm always repeating in your interviews, that law is not anymore the central piece of the picture. What is more troublesome, the dynamics in Georgian foreign politics, and those the statements or the assessments which are done by Georgian Dream, the ruling party, on regular basis. And that resonates very badly in EU member nations and in EU institutions. So we don't have to cheat ourselves. Continuing on that way, continuing with the same path, would definitely suspend, not indefinitely for sure, but suspend temporarily EU integration of Georgia. So getting back to the normalcy, which is getting back to the constitutional proviso of Georgia that every single state institution is its best endeavors to pursue as vigorously and robustly Euro-Atlantic integration, still remains something which is very much on the minds of most of Georgians and on the minds of our European and Western partners.
But don't you get an impression that the Georgian Dream Party is doing its best to actually derail Georgia from this pro-European cause, or to put it in other words, to put it on a pro-Russian track before the general elections this fall?
Indeed, we on one side we hear the statements, multiple statements by Georgian Dream that they're still pursuing the pro-EU integration. On another side, different actions and dates, of course, do not coincide, cannot be reconciled with the essence of those statements. So we still have yet to see. I won't be in rush speaking about Georgia's finally deviating from its pro-European path. And when I'm saying that I won't be in rush, more I'm relying on the Georgian society and broad support of Georgian society and our partners. So I think that based on those two points of reliance, which is domestic and non-domestic influence by EU and United States as well, I think that we have to get back to the pro-EU and pro-European, pro-Euro-Atlantic path. And of course, as you mentioned, the elections would be very much critical and would be a critical milestone for our European partners to have a better judgment and final judgment that yes, we're back to the path which we've been pursuing for more than 3 decades.
So what would you say that the West could potentially do in order to support Georgian opposition ahead of the elections?
Well, we already facing some, unfortunately, regretful to us, and bilateral relations and these related sanctions by the United States. On the 27th or 28th of June, they would be meeting at the EU level, which has to discuss the process in Georgia and developments in Georgia. And we have to expect from that meeting not just an assessment, which, most likely would be negative, no surprise, but we have to see what could be the specific measures taken as a result of those discussions. So again, sadly enough, and I'm saying this sincerely, we got to the point in our bilateral and multilateral relations that some pressure from the outside is simply unavoidable to get back to the normalcy. However, the leading force and the driving force are the Georgian people and the Georgian society.
Sure. I mean, every time we have a chance to talk about Georgia, I get the same feeling from our guests. Well, they are obviously very hopeful about the general elections this fall, just as you are. Nevertheless, I'd like to ask you about the current support for the Georgian Dream. Do we know any studies, any opinion polls about that?
You know, the survey polls are always conflicting in Georgia, and I think that Georgia is not the only exception to the rule. Different political camps, they have their own surveys. Symbology and reliability and credibility suffers to a large extent. So I won't be putting much of the stake on those survey polls. So I think that the elections would be the best. Eventually the best and ultimate reflection of the sentiments, public sentiments in the society.
I see. And do you think that the people who protested against the introduction of the controversial foreign agent law will be still that resolve to continue with the struggle up until the election, or what's the current situation? Because I guess that this flame of revolution is not as strong as it used to be only a few weeks ago.
Yeah. For God's sake, we should avoid speaking about revolution or Maidan as much as possible. That's not something which is in best interest of Georgia and its people. So the objective is twofold: get into the elections, getting in as much in a peaceful manner as possible, not to capsize the boat of stability, not to jump into the disorder and chaos. However, simultaneously and same time to keep that very much needed pressure point on Georgian society and keeping the society as much and as solidified as possible. This objective is really quite complex. It's something which is not very much ingrained into Georgian political culture, but there is no choice rather than changing the power and changing the political landscape through the elections. We cannot think of any other means, especially with the country having the EU candidate status.
And a final question: as we were looking at some of the B-roll coming from Tbilisi from those protests, I jotted down a few notes. People with banners saying, "I don't want to be another brick in Russia's wall," or 20% of my country is occupied by Russia. And it leads me to a question: do you think that if the relationship between Georgia and Russia would be normalized, that these occupied territories would somehow be annexed by Russia? Is there any prediction to what could possibly happen and what the consequences would be?
Appreciate this is a very broad issue and would be very hard to digest that in a very compact and concise response. Russians are violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Georgia. Part of the hybrid war by Russians, and we already hear those messages, could be as if facilitating with reintegrating Abkhazia and the Tskhinval region, the so-called Tskhinval region into Georgia. How much we could rely on those promises, how much of those promises which are not credible enough, and the history tells us that the promises have been breached on a regular and continued basis, how much that could be, those promises, those shallow promises, I would say, could be of enough value for us to reconsider the foreign objectives and foreign policy objectives. I think, that's the question where most of Georgians have a clear, no, it's not worthwhile at all.
Viktor Kipiani, chair of Georgian think tank organization GeoCase, thank you so much for your insight on this topic.
Thank you so much, Candide. Thank you.